The old community center hadn't seen this many people since the incident 3 years ago. Tonight, every resident of Millbrook sat in those metal folding chairs, their faces tight with worry. The emergency meeting had been called for 8 p.m. sharp. By 8:15, the murmurs had died to whispers. Then, Sarah Martinez walked through those double doors. 9 months pregnant, she moved slowly down the center aisle, her free hand supporting her swollen belly. But it was her other hand that made every person in that room forget how to breathe. In her grip, she carried a mason jar filled with murky water, and floating inside that water was something that shouldn't exist, something the town had buried forever. Sarah had been the county's lead forensic scientist before she moved to Millbrook seeking a quiet life. She'd built a reputation for solving the unsolvable. But now, carrying evidence of their collective lie, she represented their worst nightmare. The mayor's face went white. Mrs. Henderson gripped her husband's arm. Even the teenagers in the back row fell silent. What had Sarah discovered in the woods behind her new house that connected to the town's darkest secret? The silence stretched like a taut wire as Sarah continued her deliberate march toward the front. Each footstep echoed against the worn linoleum, impossibly loud in the suffocating quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made every face look gaunt and guilty. Mayor Davidson stood behind the podium, his knuckles white as he gripped its edges. He'd been preparing his carefully rehearsed speech about the proposed water treatment facility, the cover story they'd all agreed upon. Now those words died in his throat as he watched Sarah approach, the mason jar catching the light like a beacon of accusation. "Sarah," he managed, his voice cracking. "You shouldn't be here, not in your condition." She stopped 10 feet from the platform, close enough that everyone in the front rows could see the contents of the jar clearly. The water was dark, almost black, with an oily sheen that seemed to move independently of the container. But it was the small, pale object suspended within that made people lean back in their chairs. "Gentlemen, ladies," Sarah's voice carried clearly through the center, professionally calm despite the weight of what she held. "I think we need to talk." Dr. Reeves, the town's physician for 30 years, half rose from his seat. "Sarah, please, think about the baby. The stress." "The stress?" Sarah's laugh was sharp, bitter. "You're concerned about stress now?" She lifted the jar slightly, and several people visibly flinched. "After I found this in the creek bed behind my house?" Old Tom Brennan, who ran the hardware store, cleared his throat. His face had gone ashen. "Now, Sarah, that could be anything, probably just some animal. Remains, been there for 3 years, Sarah interrupted. "Is that what you were going to say, Tom?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Martha Chen, the librarian, pressed her hand to her mouth. She'd been one of the holdouts 3 years ago, one of the few who'd argued against what they'd done. The guilt had aged her a decade in the time since. Sarah turned slowly, making eye contact with as many people as she could. "I moved here because I thought Millbrook was different, a place where people cared about each other, where families could be safe." Her hand moved protectively over her belly. "Imagine my surprise when I started finding pieces." "Pieces of what?" The question came from Jake Morrison, barely 18 and too young to have been part of the original decision. He looked confused, scared by the fear radiating from the adults around him. "Jake," his mother hissed, yanking him back into his seat. Sarah's eyes fixed on the boy with something that might have been pity. "Pieces of the truth, Jake. The truth about what happened to the Garrett family." The name hit the room like a physical blow. Several people stood abruptly, chairs scraping against the floor. Reverend Walsh began muttering what sounded like a prayer. Nancy Garrett's sister, Elena, started crying silently, tears streaming down her face. "They had a right to know," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. "They had a right to a proper burial," Sarah said firmly. "Not to be scattered in pieces through the woods like garbage." Mayor Davidson found his voice again. "You don't understand the circumstances, what we faced, the choice we had to make." "I understand that 4 people died," Sarah replied. a mother, father, and 2 children. I understand that instead of reporting it, instead of letting the authorities handle it, you all decided to play judge and jury. And then you disposed of the evidence." She held up the jar again. The object inside seemed to pulse in the murky water, though that had to be a trick of the light. Had to be. "The question now," Sarah continued, "is what we're going to do about it." The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Sarah stood in the doorway of Millbrook's community center, her chest rising and falling with each labored breath. In her trembling hands, she clutched something that shouldn't exist, something the entire town had spent 15 years ensuring would never see daylight again. Mayor Hutchins was the first to break from his paralysis. His weathered face had drained of all color, and his voice came out as barely a whisper. "Sarah, where did you find that?" She stepped forward, her boots echoing against the hardwood floor with each deliberate step. The object in her hands caught the fluorescent light, its surface gleaming with an otherworldly iridescence that made several people in the front row recoil instinctively. "My basement flooded last week," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "When I was cleaning up, I found it buried under the old foundation stones, the ones that used to be part of the Blackwood house." A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Chen, who ran the local grocery store, pressed a hand to her mouth. Deputy Morgan's hand moved unconsciously toward his service weapon before he caught himself and forced his arm back to his side. "That's impossible," Dr. Reeves spoke up from his seat near the center aisle. "We made sure everything was destroyed, every last piece." Sarah's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Did we? Because this sure looks pretty intact to me." She held the object higher, and the light seemed to dance across its surface in patterns that hurt to look at directly, along with about a dozen others just like it. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Principal Watanabe stood so quickly his chair toppled backward with a crash that made everyone jump. "Others? How many others?" "Enough," Sarah replied. "More than enough." Margaret Fletcher, the town librarian who had been conspicuously silent until now, slowly rose from her seat. Her face was ashen, but her voice carried the weight of authority that came from being one of the few who remembered the early days. "Sarah, you don't understand what you're dealing with, what you've disturbed. We buried those things for a reason." "Oh, I understand perfectly." Sarah's eyes swept across the assembled faces, taking in the fear, the guilt, the desperate hope that somehow this nightmare wasn't really happening. "I understand that while I've been having blackouts for the past month, waking up in places I don't remember going to, doing things I can't recall, you've all been sitting on the truth about what really happened to the Blackwood family." A woman near the back began to cry softly. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to meet Sarah's accusing gaze. The weight of shared guilt hung heavy in the air like smoke from a fire that refused to die. "The blackouts aren't random, are they?" Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. "They started when the spring floods began, when the water table rose and disturbed what we buried. And I'm not the only one experiencing them, am I?" Several people exchanged worried glances. Tom Bradley, who owned the hardware store, cleared his throat nervously. "Sarah, maybe we should discuss this privately, with just the council members." "No." Her refusal rang out like a gunshot. "No more private meetings, no more secrets. I want everyone to know what we've done, what we're still doing." She turned the object in her hands, and its surface seemed to pulse with a light that came from within. Those closest to her could see intricate symbols carved into its surface, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. "Mrs. Chen," Sarah called out, fixing the older woman with an unwavering stare. "Tell them about your daughter's dreams, the ones where she sees the Blackwood children playing in the woods behind your house." Mrs. Chen shook her head frantically. "She's just imaginative. It doesn't mean anything." "And you, Deputy Morgan, tell them about the calls you've been getting, the reports of lights in the old Blackwood property, the sounds of children laughing where no children should be." Morgan's jaw tightened. "Equipment malfunction, false alarms. Is that what you wrote in your reports? Or did you write anything at all?" Sarah's smile was predatory. Because I checked, there are no reports, no records. Just like there were no records of what we really found in that house 15 years ago. The object in her hands pulsed brighter, and several people pressed their hands to their temples as if fighting off sudden headaches. Margaret Fletcher took a step backward, her face contorted with recognition and terror. "Sarah, please, you have to put it back, all of them, before it's too late." Too late for what? To keep pretending we didn't murder an entire family to cover up what they discovered? Too late to stop whatever we awakened when we tried to bury the evidence? The lights in the community center flickered once, twice, then settled into an ominous rhythmic pattern that matched the pulsing of the object in Sarah's hands. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Sarah stood in the doorway, her weathered hands cradling the impossible object against her chest. The crystal pulsed with that same ethereal light that had emanated from the forest for decades, but now it sat contained, domesticated somehow, in her trembling grasp. Mayor Henderson's face had drained of all color. "Sarah, put that down. You don't understand what you're—" "I understand perfectly well, Robert." Her voice carried a weight that made several people in the back rows shift uncomfortably. "I understand that my husband didn't die in a logging accident 15 years ago. I understand why my tomatoes grow 3 times their normal size, and I understand why none of our children have ever gotten seriously ill." Dr. Reeves stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "The radiation levels could be—" "Radiation?" Sarah's laugh was sharp, bitter. "Is that what you've been calling it in your little council meetings? Your sanitized reports to whatever agency pretends not to know what's happening here?" The crystal pulsed brighter, and several people gasped as their shadows danced wildly on the walls despite the steady fluorescent lighting. Old Mrs. Chen clutched her rosary, whispering prayers in Mandarin. The Kowalski twins, barely 18, grabbed each other's hands as if anchoring themselves against some invisible storm. "You all know," Sarah continued, her eyes scanning the room. "Every single one of you knows what this thing really is, what it's done to our town, what it's done to us." Tom Bradley, the fire chief, cleared his throat. "Sarah, maybe we should discuss this privately." "Privately?" The crystal flared, and for a moment everyone could see it clearly, not just light, but something living, writhing within the translucent structure. Veins of energy that pulsed like a heartbeat, connecting to invisible threads that seemed to stretch toward every person in the room. "How long have we been discussing this privately, Tom? How many more people have to disappear into those woods before we admit what we've become?" Henderson stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Sarah, think about what you're saying. Think about your daughter, about little Emma starting college next year. You want to throw all of that away?" "Emma." Sarah's voice softened, but the crystal's glow remained steady. "Sweet Emma, who can see things in the dark that others can't. Emma who's never had so much as a cold, whose paintings show places that don't exist but somehow feel familiar to all of us." She looked directly at Henderson. "Emma, who asked me last week why her blood glows blue under moonlight." A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Dr. Reeves sank back into her chair, her professional composure finally cracking. "The children, all of them?" "All of them," Sarah confirmed. "Every child born here in the last 20 years. Every child who's grown up drinking from our wells, eating from our gardens, breathing our air." She held the crystal higher, and its light revealed something horrifying. Thin, luminescent veins running beneath the skin of her forearms, pulsing in rhythm with the object she held. "My God," whispered Father Mackenzie from the 3rd row. "We're all changed." Sarah finished his sentence. "We're all changed. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" The crystal suddenly dimmed, and in the relative darkness, they could all hear it. A low humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Not just from the object in Sarah's hands, but from the walls, the floor, from their own bodies. A frequency that had become so familiar they'd stopped noticing it, like the sound of their own heartbeats. "It's not just in the forest anymore," Sarah said quietly. "It's in all of us, In our homes, our water, our blood. We can't pretend anymore. We can't keep sending people away when they start asking questions. We can't keep making people disappear. Henderson's mask finally slipped completely. They weren't made to disappear, Sarah. They were relocated for everyone's safety. David Chen didn't need relocating. Sarah's voice turned ice cold. He needed help. Instead, you sent him into those woods, and he came back as something else entirely. Something that watches our houses at night and leaves those symbols carved in our trees. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Everyone knew about the symbols, spiraling patterns that appeared overnight on fence posts, door frames, anywhere wood met wood. They'd all learned to ignore them. Another small impossibility in a town full of them. The time for secrets is over, Sarah declared, raising the crystal one final time. Tonight we decide, do we face what we've become together, or do we let it consume us one by one until there's nothing left but the light in the woods and the hunger it brings? The crystal pulsed once more, and in its glow they could all see the truth written in their own shadows. They were no longer entirely human. The whispers died the moment Sarah stepped through the heavy oak doors of the community center. Every head turned toward her, 200 faces frozen in a tableau of collective dread. Mayor Davidson's voice faltered mid-sentence, his words about routine infrastructure concerns hanging uselessly in the air. Sarah moved down the center aisle with deliberate steps, her boots echoing against the worn wooden floor. In her arms, she cradled something wrapped in what appeared to be her grandmother's quilt, the one with the faded blue roses that everyone remembered from church socials and town picnics. But the quilt couldn't quite contain what lay beneath. Dark stains seeped through the fabric, and an otherworldly luminescence pulsed faintly at the edges. Sarah. Dr. Reeves rose from his seat in the front row, his medical training overriding his shock. What happened to you? You all know what this is, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly tomb-quiet space. Every last one of you. Mrs. Chen gripped her husband's arm so tightly her knuckles went white. The Brewster twins, normally inseparable, seemed to shrink away from each other. Even old Pete Morrison, who'd lived through 3 wars and claimed nothing could surprise him anymore, looked ready to bolt for the nearest exit. Sarah reached the front of the room and turned to face the assembly. The bundle in her arms shifted slightly, and several people in the front rows flinched backward. Whatever was beneath that quilt was still alive. 47 years, she continued, her gaze sweeping across familiar faces that now seemed like strangers. 47 years of lies, of pretending, of feeding it what it needed to stay quiet. Sarah, please. Mayor Davidson's political composure was cracking like old paint. You're clearly in shock. You need medical attention. Dr. Reeves, perhaps you could... Don't. The word cracked like a whip. Sarah's attention fixed on the mayor with laser intensity. Don't you dare try to gaslight me now, not after what I've seen, not after what I've had to do. She lifted the bundle higher, and the luminescence grew stronger. In the dim lighting of the community center, it cast eerie shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly, and breath began to mist in the air. My grandmother knew, Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. She left me letters, hidden them where she knew I'd eventually find them. She couldn't live with the guilt anymore, but she was too afraid to speak up, too afraid of what you'd all do to protect your precious secret. From somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a woman began to sob, quiet, desperate sounds that spoke of long-buried shame finally clawing its way to the surface. She told me about the night it came to town, how you found it in the woods, hurt and hungry and so very angry. How you made a deal instead of doing what you should have done. Sarah's voice grew stronger, more accusatory. How you fed it, how you kept feeding it. It was different then, someone called out from the back of the room. Sarah couldn't see who. We didn't have a choice. You don't understand what it was like. I understand perfectly. Sarah's laugh was bitter, hollow. I understand that you sacrificed children to keep yourselves safe. I understand that you let families believe their sons and daughters had run away, or drowned in the lake, or gotten lost in the woods. I understand that you've built this entire community on a foundation of murdered innocence. The bundle in her arms pulsed more rapidly now, and a sound emerged from within, something between a whimper and a growl that raised goosebumps along every arm in the room. "This is the last one," Sarah said quietly. "The last child it took, Jenny Morrison, Pete's granddaughter." Old Pete's face went ashen. His lips moved soundlessly, forming denials that wouldn't come. "She's been alive all this time, kept alive to feed its hunger slowly, bit by bit, and when I found her, when I saw what you'd all allowed to happen—" Sarah's voice trailed off, but her meaning was clear. "What did you do, Sarah?" Dr. Reeves asked, though his tone suggested he already knew he didn't want the answer. Sarah's smile was terrible to behold. "I killed it. I killed your monster, and now you're going to have to live with the consequences of 47 years of cowardice." The bundle moved again, more violently this time. Whatever was happening to the thing inside that quilt, it was accelerating, and from the look on Sarah's face, that was exactly what she'd intended. The silence stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her knuckles white around the artifact that shouldn't exist. The carved stone pulsed with that sickly amber light, casting dancing shadows across the horrified faces of her neighbors. Mayor Hendricks was the first to find his voice. "Sarah, put that down, carefully." She shook her head, backing against the doorframe. "You all know what this is, don't you? You've known all along." Her voice cracked with betrayal. 23 years I've lived here, 23 years of thinking I belonged somewhere." Dr. Reeves stood slowly from his chair in the front row, his medical training warring with something much older in his eyes. "Sarah, listen to me very carefully. That object is extremely dangerous. We need to—" "We need to what?" Sarah's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Bury it again? Pretend it doesn't exist? Like you've been doing since before I was born?" The artifact's glow intensified, and several people in the back rows began murmuring in what sounded like Latin, or something older. Sarah couldn't be sure anymore what was real and what was the product of her fracturing sanity. Mrs. Chen rose from her seat, her elderly frame suddenly radiating an authority that made the air itself feel heavier. "Child, you don't understand the forces you're tampering with. That seal was placed for good reason." "Seal?" Sarah's grip tightened involuntarily, and the stone grew warm against her palms. "This thing has been calling to me for months, whispering, showing me things in my dreams." She looked around the room, seeing her neighbors' faces as if for the first time. "You're all part of it, aren't you? The accidents that keep people away from the old mill, the way newcomers always seem to change their minds about staying, the way children born here never quite leave even when they try." Tom Bradley shifted uncomfortably near the windows. His family had run the hardware store for 5 generations, and his expression held the weight of inherited secrets. "Sarah, there are things about this town that require protection. The boundaries we maintain, they're not just traditions." "Boundaries," Sarah repeated, her voice hollow. The stone was definitely warm now, almost hot. "Is that what you call the circle of dead trees around the mill? The way the animals won't go near certain places? The way my mother really died?" A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Mayor Hendricks stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Your mother died in a car accident, Sarah. You know that." "My mother died trying to leave town with me when I was 5. The words tumbled out of Sarah like water through a broken dam. She figured it out, didn't she? What you people really are, what this place really is. The artifact pulsed brighter, and hairline cracks began appearing in the windows. She tried to break whatever hold this town has on its people, and you stopped her. Dr. Reeves took another step closer, but Sarah could see something moving beneath his skin. Veins that weren't quite the right color, shadows that fell at impossible angles. "Sarah, your mother was sick, paranoid. We tried to help her, but she found this." Sarah held the artifact higher, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began forming on the windows despite the October warmth outside. "She found what you've been feeding it all these years, the travelers who disappear, the families who move away in the night, the children who are never quite the same after their 13th birthday. Mrs. Chen's facade finally cracked, revealing something ancient and hungry in her eyes. Foolish girl. Do you think we chose this? Do you think any of us wanted to be bound to this place, to that thing sleeping beneath our feet? The floor trembled, just slightly, as if something vast had stirred in the depths below the town. Dust drifted down from the ceiling fixtures, and Sarah realized with growing horror that Mrs. Chen was right about one thing. They were all trapped here. Everyone in this room was as much a prisoner as they were a jailer. But it's waking up now, isn't it? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the room. That's why you called this meeting. That's why everyone looks so scared. After all these years of keeping it quiet, keeping it fed, something's changed. The artifact in her hand suddenly blazed with light so bright that several people cried out and covered their eyes. When the glare faded, Sarah could see symbols carved into the walls that hadn't been there moments before. Ancient marks that seemed to writhe and shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. "The seal is breaking," Mayor Hendricks said quietly. "It's been breaking for weeks. We thought we could repair it before." "Before what?" Sarah demanded. Dr. Reeves met her eyes, and she saw her own death reflected there, before it wakes up completely, before it remembers what it used to be and what we took from it. The silence that followed Sarah's entrance stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Mayor Thornfield's knuckles had gone white where they gripped the podium, and Rebecca could see the muscle in his jaw working furiously. Around her, the assembled townspeople seemed frozen in a tableau of horror, their faces pale masks in the harsh fluorescent lighting. Sarah stood just inside the doorway, her mud-stained hiking boots leaving dark prints on the linoleum. The thing in her hands caught the light strangely, seeming to absorb it rather than reflect it. Rebecca forced herself to look directly at it, though every instinct screamed at her to turn away. It was a heart, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but an actual human heart, still glistening with moisture that might have been blood or something worse. But that wasn't the impossible part. The impossible part was that it was beating, slowly, rhythmically, as if it were still nestled safely within someone's chest. "Where did you find that?" Dr. Martinez's voice cracked as he rose from his seat, his medical training overriding his terror. He took a step towards Sarah, then stopped abruptly as she raised her free hand in warning. "You know where," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "The same place you've all been pretending doesn't exist for the past 15 years. Mrs. Chen let out a small whimper and pressed her face into her husband's shoulder. Rebecca noticed that several of the older residents, those who had been here during the incident, were carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone else. The newer arrivals, the ones who had moved to Millbrook after the cover-up, looked confused and frightened. "Sarah," Mayor Thornfield began, his politician's voice struggling to find its usual smooth cadence. "I think you might be in shock. Why don't you sit down and—" "Don't." The word came out sharp as broken glass. Sarah took a step forward, and the heart in her hands pulsed visibly, a wet sound accompanying each beat. "Don't you dare try to gaslight me. Not when I'm holding proof that Tommy Brennan didn't run away to the city." The name hit the room like a physical blow. Rebecca saw several people actually flinch, and old Mrs. Patterson began crying silently. Tommy Brennan. Rebecca remembered the missing person flyers that had been plastered all over town when she was just a kid. A 16-year-old boy who had supposedly packed a bag and left for bigger and better things. "That's impossible," whispered Frank Morrison, the owner of the hardware store. "Tommy's been gone for 15 years. Even if something happened to him, there wouldn't be—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Rebecca understood. There wouldn't be anything left after 15 years. Certainly not a beating heart. Sarah smiled, and there was nothing pleasant about it. "You're right, Frank, there shouldn't be. But then again, nothing about what you people did was natural, was it?" Dr. Martinez tried again, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "Sarah, that organ cannot possibly be viable. It's medically impossible for—" For what? Sarah interrupted. For a heart to keep beating outside a body? For someone to survive having their heart torn out? You're absolutely right, Doctor. Under normal circumstances, it would be impossible. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. But we both know these weren't normal circumstances. Rebecca felt ice forming in her stomach. Whatever had happened 15 years ago, whatever the town had covered up, it was worse than just a missing teenager, much worse. You need to put that down, Mayor Thornfield said, and for the first time Rebecca heard genuine fear in his voice. You don't understand what you're dealing with. I understand perfectly. Sarah's grip tightened on the heart, and it responded with a faster rhythm. I understand that you made a deal. I understand that Tommy was the price. And I understand that you've been feeding it ever since. Feeding what? The question came from Jenny Walsh, one of the newer residents. She looked around wildly, seeking answers in the faces of her neighbors. What is she talking about? What deal? But the older residents remained silent, their faces ashen. Rebecca noticed that several of them were looking not at Sarah but at the windows, as if they expected to see something looking back. Tell them, Sarah commanded, her voice rising. Tell them about the thing in the woods. Tell them about the bargain you struck to keep it satisfied. Tell them why people keep disappearing whenever the monthly offerings aren't enough. The heart in her hands began beating faster, its rhythm becoming erratic. And as it did, Rebecca became aware of a new sound filtering through the building's walls. A low humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was getting closer. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Sarah's fingers trembled around the object, its surface warm against her palms despite the autumn chill that had followed her inside. Every eye in the room tracked her movement as she stepped further into the community center, her footsteps echoing off the worn linoleum. Mayor Hendricks found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Where did you find that? Sarah's laugh held no humor. Find it? I didn't find anything, Tom. It found me. She held the crystalline fragment higher, and the overhead fluorescence caught its faceted surface, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Just like it found all of you, isn't that right? Mrs. Chen rose slowly from her folding chair, her weathered hands gripping the metal frame. Sarah, dear, you don't understand what you're dealing with. Please, just set it down gently and step away. Oh, I understand perfectly. Sarah's voice carried across the room with surprising steadiness. I understand that my daughter's nightmares weren't nightmares at all. I understand why the Hartwell family left town so suddenly last spring. I understand why no one talks about what happened to the Riverside Development Project. The fragment pulsed with an inner light, and several people in the back rows shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Reeves, the town's only physician, stood and moved toward the center aisle. Sarah, that object is dangerous. The electromagnetic properties alone could cause severe neurological damage if handled improperly. Electromagnetic properties? Sarah's eyes blazed. Is that what we're calling it now? Because my Emma calls it something else entirely. She calls it the thing that whispers. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Pastor Williams clutched his worn Bible tighter, his knuckles white against the black leather. The children aren't supposed to hear it directly. The barriers should have held. What barriers? Sarah demanded. You mean the ones that failed 3 nights ago during the storm? The ones that let this thing's influence seep into my home, into my daughter's mind? The fragment's glow intensified, and now everyone could see the strange symbols etched into its surface, characters that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. Several attendees covered their eyes, but Sarah stared at it unflinchingly. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward, his hand resting on his duty weapon, though they all knew conventional force would be useless here. Sarah, we need to contain this situation. There are protocols. Protocols? Sarah's voice cracked with desperate laughter. You mean the same protocols that kept this thing buried under our town for God knows how long? The same protocols that turned all of you into its willing servants? We're not servants, Dr. Reeves protested, though his voice lacked conviction. We're guardians. There's a difference. Guardians of what? A cosmic parasite that feeds on human consciousness. Something that's been slowly poisoning our children, our families. Sarah's grip on the fragment tightened, and veins of light began spreading up her arms like luminous infection. Mayor Hendricks lurched to his feet, his face pale with terror. "Sarah, don't let it into your system. Fight it. We can help you if you just... help me." Sarah's eyes now held the same ethereal glow as the fragment. "The way you helped the Morrison twins before they disappeared. The way you helped old Mr. Garrett before he walked into the lake." Mrs. Chen began moving down the side aisle, her movements careful and deliberate. "Those were necessary sacrifices, Sarah, to maintain the balance, to keep it sleeping. But it's not sleeping anymore, is it?" Sarah could feel the fragment's consciousness pressing against her mind, vast and alien and hungry. The storm damaged more than just your barriers. It woke something up. The overhead lights flickered, and several people began backing toward the exits. But the doors had already begun to frost over, ice crystals spreading across the glass with impossible speed. "Nobody leaves," Sarah said, though her voice now carried harmonics that hadn't been there moments before. "Not until we finish this conversation." Pastor Williams stepped into the center aisle, his Bible held before him like a shield. "In the name of all that is holy, I command you to release that woman." The fragment pulsed once, blindingly bright, and Pastor Williams collapsed to his knees, blood streaming from his nose. His Bible burst into flames that burned cold and blue. "Your human concepts of divinity are quaint," Sarah spoke, but the voice was layered now with something far older and infinitely more terrible. "But I have been divine since before your species crawled from the primordial mud." Dr. Reeves backed against the wall, his medical training useless in the face of something that defied all natural law. "Sarah, if any part of you is still in there, remember Emma. Remember your daughter." For just a moment, the glow in Sarah's eyes flickered, and her true voice broke through. "Emma," she whispered. "My baby girl." The fragment's light dimmed slightly, and in that brief respite, everyone in the room understood that their decades-long secret was about to become something far worse than exposure. It was about to become extinction. The silence stretched like a taut wire as Sarah's words echoed through the community center. Elder Morrison's face had gone ashen, his weathered hands gripping the podium until his knuckles turned white. The crystal pulsed again in Sarah's palm, its otherworldly glow casting dancing shadows across the stunned faces of the townspeople. "You don't understand what you're holding," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Put it down before..." "Before what?" Sarah stepped forward, raising the crystal higher. "Before it shows everyone else what it showed me, before they see the truth about what really happened to the missing families." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Chen clutched her husband's arm, her eyes wide with recognition. Several people in the back began pushing toward the exits, but found their way blocked by others who seemed frozen in place, transfixed by the crystal's hypnotic pulse. The artifact's glow intensified, and suddenly the air itself seemed to shimmer. Images began forming in the light, translucent at first, then gaining clarity and substance. Sarah felt the crystal growing warm, almost hot, but she couldn't let go. It was as if the thing had fused with her palm. "No," Morrison breathed, stepping down from the platform. "Sarah, please, you have no idea what you're unleashing." But it was too late. The visions were already manifesting, filling the space above their heads like a terrible aurora. The townspeople saw flashes of the old settlement, the one that had existed here before Millbrook. They saw the original colonists huddled around similar crystals, their faces twisted with hunger and desperation during that brutal winter of 1847. "Stop this," Dr. Reeves called out from somewhere in the crowd. "The containment protocols exist for a reason." Sarah spun toward his voice, surprised. "You knew? You all knew?" The crystal pulsed brighter, responding to her emotional surge, and the visions shifted. Now they showed more recent scenes. The Patterson family from 3 years ago, walking into the woods with vacant expressions. The Morrison twins, age 14, following the same path just last spring, all of them carrying identical crystals, all of them drawn by the same inexorable pull. They're not dead, Sarah realized aloud, her voice filled with horror and wonder. They're still out there. Elder Morrison had reached the center aisle now, his hands extended in a placating gesture. Sarah, listen to me very carefully. What you're holding isn't just an artifact, it's a conduit. Every time someone activates one, it strengthens the connection. Connection to what? To them. To what our ancestors became when they used the crystals to survive that winter. They're still alive, Sarah, all of them, changed, but alive. And they're hungry. The temperature in the room began to drop noticeably. Several people's breaths started misting, and frost began forming on the windows. The crystal was no longer just glowing, it was singing, a low harmonic that seemed to resonate in everyone's bones. Sarah felt something shift in her perception. The familiar faces around her suddenly looked different, wrong somehow. She could see traces of something ancient and alien lurking beneath their human features. Mrs. Chen's eyes held depths that hadn't been there moments before. Mr. Garrett's shadow seemed to move independently of his body. "How many of you?" Sarah asked, backing toward the wall. "How many of you aren't really human anymore?" Morrison's expression crumbled. "We're still human, Sarah. We're just more than we were. The crystals don't just take, they give. Enhanced senses, extended lifespans, abilities your kind can't imagine. But the price, the missing families, you feed them to whatever's out there." "Not feed," Dr. Reeves corrected, pushing through the crowd. "Transform. We've been protecting this town for generations, maintaining the balance. A few join the collective every few years, and in return, the rest of us are kept safe." The crystal song was growing louder, more insistent. Sarah could feel it calling to something in the darkness beyond the town limits, something vast and patient and eternally hungry. "But you chose them," she said, understanding flooding through her. "You decided who would be taken." "We chose those who wouldn't be missed," Morrison admitted. "Troubled families, people on the margins. It was the most humane way to—" "There is no humane way." Sarah's shout made the crystal flare like a small sun. The visions above their heads exploded outward, showing the true nature of what lurked in the woods surrounding Millbrook. Ancient things wearing human faces, sustained by an unholy fusion of flesh and crystal and will. But as the light reached its peak, Sarah saw something else in the crystal's depths. A way to break the cycle. The knowledge flooded into her mind like ice water, terrible and necessary and utterly clear. She looked around the room one last time, meeting the eyes of her neighbors, her friends, her community. Some were still human, others had been touched by the crystal's influence for so long they'd forgotten which side of the line they stood on. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and shattered the crystal against the floor. The silence in the town hall stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Sarah stood frozen at the podium, the ancient leather journal clutched against her chest, feeling the weight of every stare boring into her. The pages seemed to pulse with their own malevolent energy, and she could swear she heard whispers emanating from between the yellowed sheets. Mayor Hendricks was the first to break the spell. His face had drained of all color, and when he spoke, his voice cracked like old parchment. "Where did you find that?" "Does it matter?" Sarah's voice was steadier than she felt. "What matters is what's written inside, what you've all been hiding." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Chen gripped her husband's arm so tightly her knuckles went white. The Williamson family huddled together in the back row, their teenage daughter's eyes wide with terror. Even old Tom Fletcher, who never showed emotion about anything, was visibly trembling. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," came a voice from the middle of the room. It was Dr. Reeves, the town physician, his usual composed demeanor cracked like a broken mirror. "That book, it should have been destroyed decades ago." Sarah opened the journal, and the whispers grew louder. Several people in the front row recoiled as if struck. Should I read from it, Doctor? Should I share what really happened in 1987? What about the Patterson family? The real reason they disappeared? Stop. The word came from everywhere at once, spoken by at least a dozen voices in unison. The synchronicity sent ice through Sarah's veins, but she pressed on. It says here that this town made a choice, a bargain. She flipped through pages that seemed to turn themselves. Every generation, you feed it. You select families, newcomers who won't be missed immediately, and in return, it protects the rest of you. Mayor Hendricks stepped down from his seat, his movements stiff and mechanical. Sarah, close the book. You're waking things that need to stay asleep. But Sarah was reading now, her voice gaining strength with each word. The entity requires sustenance to maintain the barrier. Fresh blood, fresh fear, fresh souls to fuel its hunger. In exchange, it shields the community from the greater darkness that would otherwise consume everything within a 50-mile radius. As she spoke, the temperature in the room began to drop. Frost appeared on the windows despite the summer heat outside. The overhead lights flickered, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. The Pattersons weren't the first, Sarah continued, her breath now visible in the frigid air. The Kowalskis in 78, the Martinez family in 83, the Thompsons just last year. You told everyone they moved away, started fresh somewhere else, but they're still here, aren't they? Still feeding it. A sound began to build beneath the floorboards, a low, rhythmic thumping that matched the cadence of a massive heartbeat. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with it, and several townspeople had gone pale with terror. Enough! Dr. Reeves lunged forward, reaching for the journal, but Sarah pulled it away. The feeding cycle is accelerating, she read, backing toward the exit. Each sacrifice makes it stronger, hungrier. Soon it won't be satisfied with just one family every few years. It will want more. The thumping grew louder, and now there were other sounds joining it. Scratching, scraping, as if something massive was clawing its way up from deep underground. The wooden floor began to bow and crack. "You stupid girl," hissed Mrs. Chen, her elderly face contorting with rage. "Do you think we had a choice? Do you think we wanted this? It was here before we were, sleeping beneath the town. We either fed it or it would have taken us all. But it's not just taking the families you choose anymore, is it?" Sarah backed against the door, feeling for the handle. "My sister Emma. She wasn't supposed to be chosen yet. Something's changing." The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. Mayor Hendricks closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "The agreement is breaking down. It's getting stronger, more demanding. We've run out of newcomers, out of families we can sacrifice without drawing attention. So you decided to start feeding it our own children. We decided to survive," Dr. Reeves spat, "just like we've done for 40 years. The floor cracked open near the podium, releasing a smell like rotting earth and something far worse. A sound emerged from the fissure, not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something that bypassed the ears and went straight to the primitive brainstem, triggering every evolutionary fear response at once. Sarah felt the door handle turn beneath her desperate fingers. "Well, I've got news for all of you. The feeding stops now. I'm going to find a way to kill it." She yanked the door open and fled into the night, clutching the journal tight, as behind her the town hall erupted into chaos and inhuman sounds that would haunt her dreams forever. The silence in the town hall stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her fingers trembling around the ancient leather journal that had been buried beneath the Whitmore house for decades. Every eye in the room fixed upon her, faces drained of color as the weight of recognition settled over them like a burial shroud. Mayor Hendricks was the first to break. His weathered hands gripped the podium until his knuckles went white, and when he spoke, his voice cracked like autumn leaves. "Sarah, child, where did you find that?" She stepped forward, her boots echoing hollow against the wooden floor. The journal felt heavier with each step, as if the secrets contained within were gaining mass, pulling her towards some inevitable reckoning. "In the foundation of my grandmother's house. hidden behind a false wall that my renovations exposed. Dr. Patel shifted uncomfortably in the front row, his medical bag clutched protectively against his chest. Behind him, the Thornfield twins whispered urgently to each other, their identical faces masks of barely contained panic. Even Father Miguel had abandoned his usual composure, rosary beads clicking frantically through his fingers. "You don't understand what you're holding," Hendricks continued, descending from the podium with careful, measured steps. "That book contains things that were meant to stay buried, things that protect this town." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was sharp and brittle, cutting through the thick atmosphere like broken glass. "Protect? Is that what you call it?" She opened the journal, pages crackling with age, and began to read. October 13th, 1887. "The hunger grows stronger. We fed it the Morrison boy yesterday, but it's not enough. Never enough." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Chen covered her mouth, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Several people began rising from their seats, but Hendricks raised his hand, commanding them to remain still. "You're taking it out of context," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The founders of this town faced impossible choices. What they did was make a deal with something that should have been left alone. Sarah flipped through more pages, her grandmother's careful handwriting revealing horrors that had been sanitized into local folklore. They thought they could control it, contain it, feed it just enough to keep it satisfied while reaping the benefits of its protection. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Windows began to fog despite the October warmth outside, and several people pulled their jackets tighter around themselves. In the back corner, old Mr. Vecchio started muttering prayers in Italian, his voice growing more frantic with each Ave Maria. "The crops that never failed during droughts," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as the truth poured out. "The way diseases seemed to skip over our town while neighboring communities suffered. The prosperity that made no logical sense for a place this isolated." She fixed her gaze on Dr. Patel. "How many times have you falsified death certificates? How many families were told their loved ones died of natural causes when you knew better?" Patel stood abruptly, his chair clattering backward. "You think this is easy for us? You think we enjoy living with this burden? Every generation has carried this weight, made these sacrifices, because the alternative is freedom," Sarah cut him off. "Freedom from feeding children to something that masquerades as our protector." She held up a faded photograph that had been tucked between the journal's pages. "My sister Emma, the one who supposedly drowned in Miller's Creek when we were 8, except Miller's Creek was bone dry that summer, wasn't it?" The photograph passed through several hands, each person who saw it growing paler than the last. Emma's face smiled back at them, captured in her Sunday dress just days before the town claimed another innocent soul for their devil's bargain. Father Miguel rose slowly, his clerical collar stark against his suddenly ashen complexion. "Sarah, if you truly understand what's written in that book, then you know what happens if we stop. The protection ends. The thing beneath our town will turn its hunger outward, and it will consume everything in its path until someone else takes up the burden." "Maybe," Sarah said, closing the journal with a definitive snap. "Or maybe it's grown so fat and complacent on our offerings that it's forgotten how to hunt for itself. Maybe it's time we stopped enabling a monster and started fighting it." Thunder rumbled overhead despite the clear evening sky, and the lights in the town hall flickered ominously. Through the windows, the street lamps began dimming one by one, as if something vast and hungry had stirred in response to their conversation. Hendricks stepped closer, his hand extended toward the journal. "Give it back, Sarah. Let us handle this the way it's always been handled. Your grandmother understood. My grandmother was a coward." The words hit the room like a physical blow. "And so are all of you." The artifact pulsed in Sarah's trembling hands, its obsidian surface rippling like disturbed water, despite remaining solid to the touch. The emergency meeting had dissolved into chaos the moment she'd stepped through the community center doors, But now an eerie silence had settled over the crowd, every eye fixed on the impossible object she cradled against her chest. "Where did you find it?" Mayor Hendrick's voice cracked, his usual authority reduced to a whisper. Behind him, the town council members had gone pale, their carefully maintained facades crumbling. Sarah's laugh carried a bitter edge. "Find it? It found me, just like it found all of you, didn't it?" She took a step forward, and the artifact's glow intensified, casting writhing shadows across the walls. "Except you knew what it was. You've always known." Mrs. Chen rose from her seat in the front row, her weathered hands clutching her purse. "Sarah, dear, you don't understand what you're holding. Please, set it down slowly." "Don't understand?" Sarah's voice rose to a shriek. "I understand perfectly. I understand why my grandmother's journals were hidden in the basement. I understand why half this town shares the same birthmark. I understand why we never leave, and why outsiders who stay too long start changing." The artifact began to sing, a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. Several people in the crowd winced, pressing their hands to their ears. Others, Sarah noticed, seemed almost entranced by the sound. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, his medical bag clutched defensively. "The singing means it's responding to emotion, strong emotion. Sarah, I need you to try to calm down." "Calm down?" Sarah spun toward him, and the artifact's song shifted into a higher register. "My husband is dead, Doctor, torn apart by something that shouldn't exist. And now I know you all could have prevented it." "That's not true," Hendricks protested, but his words lacked conviction. "The barriers have held for over a century. We couldn't have known." "The barriers you maintained with blood," Sarah interrupted. "My blood, David's blood, the blood of everyone in this room who doesn't know the truth." She gestured to a cluster of younger residents who looked as confused and terrified as she felt. "How many of us have you sacrificed to keep your secret safe?" The artifact's surface began to crack, hairline fractures spreading across its smooth exterior. Through the gaps, something that wasn't quite light seeped out, a purple-black radiance that made the air itself seem to bend and twist. "Sarah, listen to me." Mrs. Chen's voice took on an urgent quality. "That artifact is a key, what lies beyond the barriers. It's not evil, but it's not meant for this world. Our ancestors made a pact to keep it contained, to keep both worlds safe." "Safe?" Sarah's grip tightened, and more cracks appeared. "David is dead. Jenny Morrison disappeared last month. How many others? How is any of this safe?" "The feeding cycle," whispered Tom Bradley from the back of the room. "It was supposed to be voluntary. The founding families were supposed to provide willing participants when the barriers weakened." A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd. Even some of the council members looked shocked. "Willing participants," Sarah repeated slowly. "You mean you've been feeding people to whatever's out there?" "Not feeding," Hendricks said desperately. "Merging. They become part of the barrier itself, guardians between worlds. It's an honor. An honor you never offered to claim for yourselves," Sarah shot back. "An honor you saved for the rest of us." The artifact was nearly split in half now, its song becoming a discordant wail. Through the widening cracks, impossible geometries flickered, spaces that folded in on themselves, colors that had no names. Several people began backing toward the exits, but the doors wouldn't budge. "The containment protocols," Dr. Martinez breathed. "They've activated automatically." Sarah felt the artifact growing heavier in her hands, as if it were filling with some dense liquid. The temperature in the room began to drop, their breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. On the walls, frost patterns spread in spiraling fractals that hurt to look at directly. "Tell me how to save them," she demanded. "Tell me how to bring back David, Jenny, all of them." Mrs. Chen shook her head sadly. "Once merged with the barrier, they can't return." "But Sarah, if you break that artifact completely, you'll tear down everything that keeps the two worlds separate. Everyone dies, everyone in both worlds." "Then tell me the truth, all of it, right now." Sarah raised the artifact above her head, its cracks spreading faster. or I'll take my chances with whatever's on the other side." The room held its collective breath as the council members exchanged desperate glances. Finally, Mayor Hendricks stepped forward, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "The truth," he said heavily, "is that we're all prisoners here. And the thing we've been feeding isn't the real threat. It's the only thing standing between us and something infinitely worse." The silence that followed Sarah's revelation stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Mayor Hendricks sat frozen at the podium, his weathered face pale as moonlight. The crystalline fragment in Sarah's palm pulsed with that otherworldly luminescence, casting dancing shadows across the stunned faces of the assembled townspeople. "You don't understand what you're holding," Dr. Reeves whispered from the front row, his voice barely audible over the collective-held breath of 300 people. "Sarah, please, put it down." Sarah's laugh was sharp, brittle. "Oh, I understand perfectly. I understand that my husband didn't die in a hunting accident. I understand that those missing hikers weren't killed by bears." She raised the fragment higher, and several people in the back rows scrambled toward the exits. "I understand that this entire town has been feeding something in the woods for 60 years. The fragment's glow intensified, and through the community center's windows, an answering light flickered deep in the tree line. A low, subsonic rumble made the building's foundation tremble. "It knows," old Pete croaked from his wheelchair near the side wall. "God help us all, it knows we've got a piece of it." Mayor Hendricks found his voice at last. "Sarah, listen to me. Your husband knew the risks when he volunteered for the patrols. We all do. But what we're protecting here, what we're keeping contained—" "Contained?" Sarah's eyes blazed with fury. "You call this contained? It's growing stronger every year. The disappearances are happening more frequently. And now I know why." She reached into her jacket pocket with her free hand and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "I found this in the old mine shaft, along with the fragment. Want to know what really happened in 1963? The rumbling grew louder. Through the windows, more lights began to pulse in the darkness between the trees, as if the forest itself was awakening. Several of the younger residents, those born after the compact was sealed, looked around in growing terror. "The mining accident wasn't an accident," Sarah continued, her voice rising above the building tremor. "The excavation team broke through into something that had been sleeping under the mountain for centuries, something that should have stayed buried. And instead of sealing it back up, instead of running, our ancestors made a deal." Dr. Reeves stood slowly, his medical bag clutched in white-knuckled hands. "They saved the town, Sarah. Without the compact, that thing would have consumed everything for 100 miles. "The compact?" Sarah flipped through the journal's pages. "You mean the agreement to provide regular sacrifices in exchange for being left alone? To maintain the feeding schedule that keeps it dormant most of the time?" A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the truth was finally spoken aloud. For decades, it had been euphemistically referred to as the arrangement or the understanding, never by its true name. The lights in the forest were moving now, descending from the mountain slopes toward the town's perimeter. The rumbling had become a rhythmic pulsing, like a massive heartbeat echoing through bedrock. "Put the fragment down, Sarah." Sheriff Martinez had appeared at the back of the room, though no one had seen him enter. His gun was drawn but pointed at the floor. "You're calling it here, into the town, into the safe zone." Sarah turned to face him, and in the fragment's glow, her face looked gaunt and hollow. "Safe? Tell that to my husband. Tell that to the Peterson boy, or Jenny Walsh, or any of the others who drew the short straw in your sick lottery." The building shuddered as something massive moved past outside. Through the windows, a shadow fell across the community center, too large, too wrong in its proportions to be anything natural. The fragment in Sarah's hand began to sing, a crystalline tone that made several people cover their ears. The feeding schedule was disrupted when Sarah took the fragment, Dr. Reeves said urgently to the sheriff. "It's been 3 weeks since the last offering, and now part of its essence is in here with us." Sarah's grip tightened on both the fragment and the journal. I'm not putting anything down until everyone in this room hears the truth, until they know about the selection committee, until they know their names might be next on the list." The singing of the fragment had become a scream. Outside, windows began shattering up and down Main Street. Car alarms wailed in the distance, their electronic voices adding to the cacophony. Mayor Hendricks stepped down from the podium, his hands raised in supplication. "Sarah, please. If you don't surrender the fragment, it won't just take one of us, it will take all of us. The compact will be broken, and everything our families built here will be consumed." Sarah looked around the room at the faces of her neighbors, people she had known her entire life, people who had helped raise her children, people who had attended her husband's funeral with tears in their eyes and lies on their lips. "Maybe," she said quietly, "that's exactly what should happen." The silence in the community center stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Sarah's fingers trembled around the ornate silver compass, its needle spinning wildly despite the absence of any magnetic interference. The ancient symbols etched into its surface pulsed with a faint blue light that shouldn't have been possible. Yet everyone in the room could see it. Mayor Davidson's face had drained of all color. "Sarah, where did you find that?" "In my grandmother's basement," she whispered, her voice carrying in the dead quiet. "Hidden behind a false wall that I only discovered after the pipes burst last week." Her eyes swept across the familiar faces of her neighbors, seeing fear and recognition in equal measure. "She left me a letter, told me everything." Mrs. Chen stood abruptly from her seat in the third row, her chair scraping against the floor like fingernails on a chalkboard. "You don't understand what you're holding, child. Put it away before—" "Before what?" Sarah's voice cracked. "Before the hollow ones sense it. They already have, haven't they? That's why the Johnson family disappeared 3 nights ago. That's why we found those symbols burned into the Petersons' lawn." Dr. Reeves stepped forward, his medical bag clutched protectively against his chest. Inside, Sarah knew, were the specialized tools he'd been using for decades to perform the monthly ritual. The same tools her grandmother had described in horrifying detail in her letter. "Your grandmother was supposed to destroy that compass," he said, his usual calm demeanor fracturing. "It was part of the agreement when she stepped down as guardian. Without it dormant, the barrier weakens every day." The compass in Sarah's hands grew warm, its spinning needle suddenly snapping to point directly at the basement beneath the community center. Everyone in the room instinctively stepped back from that direction, their inherited fear running deeper than rational thought. Fire Chief Murphy's radio crackled to life. "Chief, we've got another situation on Elm Street. The Hendersons are reporting shadows moving through their walls, same as the others." Sarah felt the weight of every eye in the room. These people, her neighbors, her friends, had been living with this secret for generations. The compass wasn't just pointing toward the basement, it was pointing toward the entrance to something that should have remained buried forever. "The hollow ones are testing the boundaries," whispered Father Martinez from the back row, "just like they did in 1847, and 1902, and 1967. His voice carried the weight of inherited knowledge passed down through parish records that weren't meant for public consumption. "Each time the Guardian managed to renew the binding," Mayor Davidson said, approaching Sarah cautiously as if she might bolt. "But your grandmother, she got sick so quickly. There wasn't time to properly train a replacement." Sarah's laugh held no humor. "So you all just decided to let me live in ignorance? Let me inherit a house sitting on top of a supernatural fault line without warning me?" The compass needle began spinning again, faster now. Through the floor, a low humming sound emerged, something between a moan and a mechanical whir. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered in response. "The barrier is failing tonight," Dr. Reeves stated with clinical detachment. "With or without a guardian, we have perhaps 6 hours before the binding collapses entirely." "What happens then?" Sarah demanded, though part of her already knew the answer from her grandmother's letter. Old man Kruger, who hadn't spoken at a town meeting in anyone's memory, stood up slowly. His voice came out as a rasp. "The hollow ones pour through. They take our forms, our memories, our lives. Then they spread beyond Millbrook, wearing our faces, carrying our identities into the wider world. The humming beneath the floor grew louder. Somewhere in the distance a dog began howling, a sound of pure terror that was quickly joined by others until the entire town seemed to echo with canine distress. Sarah looked down at the compass. Its blue glow was pulsing faster now, almost like a heartbeat. She thought of her grandmother's final words in the letter. "The choice will be yours, my dear one. Accept the burden and save them all, or let the sins of our ancestors finally come home to roost." "There's still time," Mayor Davidson pleaded. "If you take up the guardian's role willingly, the compass will guide you through the renewal ritual. Your grandmother left detailed instructions." "Instructions that require a blood sacrifice," Sarah interrupted. "A life freely given to maintain the binding for another generation." The room fell silent except for the growing hum from below. Everyone understood the weight of what she was saying. Everyone knew what the ritual truly demanded. Sarah closed her eyes and felt the compass pulling her toward the basement door, toward her destiny, toward a choice that would determine the fate of everyone she'd ever known. The hollow ones were waiting. The silence in the town hall stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Sarah stood at the threshold, her trembling hands clutched around the obsidian mirror fragment, its surface rippling with impossible shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. Every eye in the packed room fixed on her, and she could feel the weight of their collective terror pressing against her chest. Mayor Davidson's face had drained of all color. "Sarah, put that down. You don't understand what you're—" "I understand perfectly." Her voice cut through his words with a clarity that surprised even herself. "I understand that my daughter didn't run away. I understand that the Hendersons didn't move to Florida. I understand that every missing person in this town for the past 30 years has fed this thing." The mirror pulsed in her hands, and whispers began to emanate from its surface. Voices she recognized. Emma's voice, sweet and frightened, calling for her mother. Mr. Henderson pleading for release. Dozens of others, a chorus of the consumed, all trapped within the dark glass. Dr. Reeves stood slowly from his front row seat, his medical bag clutched protectively against his chest. "The binding ritual requires unanimous consent. If you've broken the seal..." "The seal was broken the moment you decided my Emma was expendable." Sarah stepped forward, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began forming on the windows despite the October heat outside. "You all knew. Every single one of you voted to sacrifice her." Margaret Thorne, the librarian who had always smiled so kindly at Emma, buried her face in her hands. "We thought if we could just maintain the balance, keep feeding it small offerings, it would stay contained. The alternative was to actually fight it." Sarah's grip tightened on the mirror, and cracks began spreading across its surface. Each crack released more voices, more anguished cries of the trapped souls, but that would have required courage you don't possess. Principal Watson stood up abruptly. "You can't destroy it, Sarah. The entity isn't trapped in that mirror. The mirror is what keeps it from breaking into our world completely. If you shatter it, it gets free." She finished his sentence, watching as understanding dawned on several faces. "Yes, I know. Dr. Blackwood's journal was very thorough about the consequences. The question is, do I care anymore?" A commotion erupted as people began pushing toward the exits, but the doors had sealed themselves shut with an otherworldly grinding sound. The mirror's influence was spreading, reality bending around its presence. Sheriff Collins drew his weapon with shaking hands. "Sarah, think about what you're doing. If that thing gets loose, it won't just kill us. It'll spread beyond Millbrook. Innocent people..." "Like Emma was innocent?" The mirror fragment felt impossibly heavy now, as if it contained the weight of all the consumed souls. "You had decades to find another way. Instead, you institutionalized murder." The lights began flickering as shadows peeled away from the walls, taking on semi-solid forms. The boundary between dimensions was weakening with each crack that spread across the mirror's surface. Father Miguel crossed himself and began muttering prayers in Latin, but even his faith seemed inadequate against what was manifesting in the room. "Sarah, Your daughter's soul. If you release the entity, she'll be lost forever. Right now, part of her still exists in there." That gave Sarah pause. She looked down at the mirror, seeing Emma's face swimming just beneath the surface, mouth open in a silent scream. Her maternal instinct warred with her rage. "There's another way," said a voice from the back of the room. Old Joe Brennan, the town drunk who everyone dismissed as harmless and addled, stepped forward. His usual stumbling gait was gone, replaced by purposeful steps. "The mirror can be turned inward." Mayor Davidson spun around. "Joe, shut your mouth." "No." Joe's voice carried an authority no one had ever heard from him before. "I've been guarding the real secret for 40 years, waiting for someone brave enough to use it. The entity can be forced to consume itself, but it requires a willing sacrifice from someone pure of heart." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold filling the room. "You mean someone has to carry the mirror into the entity's realm and trigger the implosion from the inside? They'll die, but everyone it's consumed will be released, and it'll be destroyed permanently." The whispers from the mirror grew more urgent, Emma's voice rising above the others. "Mama, don't let them trick you again. There's something else, something they're not telling you." Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people she'd trusted, people she'd considered friends and neighbors. In their eyes she saw the same calculating coldness that had allowed them to feed children to a monster for 3 decades. The mirror pulsed again, and she felt Emma's presence more strongly than ever. "Tell me the rest of it, Joe," Sarah said quietly. "Tell me what they're still hiding." The artifact pulsed with an otherworldly light as Sarah held it above her head, its crystalline surface reflecting the terrified faces of every person packed into the town hall. The whispers died instantly, replaced by a suffocating silence that seemed to press against the walls themselves. "You all know what this is," Sarah's voice carried across the room with surprising steadiness, though her hands trembled slightly. "You've spent decades pretending it doesn't exist, building your lies around its absence." Mayor Hendricks stepped forward, his face ashen. "Sarah, you don't understand what you're—" "I understand perfectly." She lowered the artifact slightly, cradling it against her chest where it cast dancing shadows across her features. "I understand that my daughter died because of your silence, because every single one of you chose to protect this town's reputation over human lives." In the third row, Mrs. Chen covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Behind her, the Kowalski family sat rigid as statues, their teenage son's eyes fixed on the floor. The weight of collective guilt was almost tangible, pressing down on the assembly like a physical force. Dr. Reeves cleared his throat, his medical authority suddenly seeming fragile and insufficient. "The artifact has been contained for good reason. What happened to Emma was tragic, but releasing its influence—" "Contained." Sarah's laugh was bitter, hollow. "You call hiding it in the old mine shaft contained? You call pretending it doesn't exist while it slowly poisons our children contained?" She gestured toward the artifact, its light intensifying. "This thing has been feeding off us for generations. Every unexplained illness, every child who grew up wrong, every family that just disappeared." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Several people near the back began shifting toward the exits, but the doors remained firmly shut, as if sealed by some invisible force. The artifact's influence was spreading, Sarah realized, responding to the emotional turmoil surrounding it. "My grandmother knew," continued old Pete Morrison from his wheelchair near the front. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the supernatural quiet it carried to every corner. "She told me stories before she died. Said the thing came down from the sky in 1943 during the war. Government men came to take it, but it was already too late. It had already chosen this place." "Pete, no," Mayor Hendricks warned, but the old man continued as if compelled. "It feeds on secrets, on shame, on the things we bury deep and try to forget. The more we denied its existence, the stronger it became." His rheumy eyes found Sarah's. "Your Emma got too close to the truth, didn't she? Started asking questions about the patterns in the medical records. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. She was studying the birth defects, the cancer clusters, the unexplained psychological breaks. She mapped everything going back 70 years. She found the epicenter. She held up the artifact again. And when she went to investigate, it killed her, made it look like an accident. But if you're holding it now, Dr. Reeves began, then stopped as understanding dawned on his face. Dear God, you went into the mine. I went where my daughter died, and I found this waiting for me, like it knew I was coming. Sarah's voice grew stronger. It showed me everything, every lie, every cover-up, every family you sacrificed to keep your secret. The Hendersons in 78, the Walsh twins in 94, the Miller boy just last year. The crowd stirred uneasily. These were names they all recognized, deaths they'd all accepted as tragic accidents or unexplained illnesses. But the pattern was undeniable once exposed. So what do you want? Mayor Hendricks asked, his political composure finally cracking. Revenge? To destroy us all? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the artifact in her hands. Its light had shifted from cold blue to warm amber, as if responding to her intentions. I want the truth, all of it. I want every family that suffered to know why. And then... She paused, feeling the weight of decision. Then we decide together what happens next. The artifact won't just disappear, Dr. Reeves warned. Even if we expose everything, tell the world what happened here, it will still exist, still need to be contained somehow. Maybe containment was never the answer, Sarah replied. Maybe that's why it's grown stronger all these years, because you fed it exactly what it wanted, silence and shame. She looked around the room at faces she'd known her entire life. Maybe it's time to try something different. The artifact pulsed once more, brighter than before, and every person in the room felt something shift in the air around them. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was no turning back from whatever came next. The silence in the community center stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Sarah stood at the front of the room, the ancient binding glowing faintly in her trembling hands. Every eye was fixed on the impossible sight before them, the very thing that had kept their town's darkness contained for over a century, now cracked and bleeding ethereal light through its damaged seals. Mayor Collins was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Sarah, where did you find that? In my grandmother's basement, she replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she held, hidden behind a false wall, along with her journals. Journals that explain everything about what this town really is, what we've all been living on top of. A collective shudder ran through the assembled crowd. Parents pulled their children closer. The older residents, those who remembered the stories their own grandparents had whispered in the dark, began backing toward the exits. You don't understand what you're holding, Dr. Reeves said, rising from his seat in the front row. His face had gone ashen, and Sarah noticed his hands were shaking. That binding was never meant to be moved from its resting place. Sarah lifted the artifact higher, and the cracks in its surface pulsed with an otherworldly light that made everyone in the room feel sick to their stomachs. Oh, but I do understand, Doctor. I understand perfectly. This isn't just some relic, it's a prison, and the thing it's been keeping locked away has been getting stronger while we've all been pretending our little town is normal. She opened one of the yellow journals with her free hand, careful not to disturb the binding's precarious integrity. My grandmother writes about the first binding ceremony in 1923, how the town founders didn't just settle here by accident, they were running from something that followed them here and had to be contained. The whispers started then, a low murmur of fear and recognition rippling through the crowd. Sarah caught fragments, always knew something was wrong, and the dreams had been getting worse, and we should have left years ago. Children who've gone missing over the decades, Sarah continued, her voice cutting through the panic. They weren't runaways or victims of human trafficking. They were offerings, sacrifices to keep the binding strong and the thing below satisfied with smaller meals instead of consuming us all. Mrs. Patterson stood up abruptly. her chair clattering to the floor. "That's enough. You don't know what you're talking about, child. Some secrets are kept for good reason." "Secrets?" Sarah's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Is that what we're calling child murder now? Because that's what this is. That's what this town has been built on for generations, and now the binding is failing, and instead of finding a real solution, you're all just hoping it holds together long enough for the problem to become someone else's responsibility." As if summoned by her words, a deep rumble emanated from beneath their feet. The building groaned, dust falling from the rafters as something vast and hungry stirred in the depths below the town. The binding in Sarah's hands grew brighter, its light now painful to look at directly. "Put it back," Mayor Collins commanded, his composure finally cracking. "Sarah, I'm begging you, put it back where you found it before it's too late." "Too late for what?" Sarah demanded. "Too late to finally face what we've become? Too late to stop pretending that sacrificing children every few years is an acceptable price for our comfortable lives?" Another tremor shook the building, stronger this time. Car alarms began wailing outside, and in the distance, they could hear windows shattering as the thing below tested the weakening bonds that held it. Dr. Reeves pulled out his phone with shaking fingers. "I'm calling the state police. This has gone too far." "No," Sarah said firmly. "This isn't something the outside world can fix. This is our responsibility, our burden to bear." She looked around the room at the terrified faces surrounding her. "But I'm not putting this back so we can continue the cycle. I'm not going to be part of a system that feeds children to monsters." "Then what do you propose?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her voice tight with fear and anger. "Because if that thing gets free, it won't just consume a few missing children. It will devour everything, the entire town, then spread outward until nothing is left." Sarah closed the journal and clutched the failing binding closer to her chest. The artifact was growing warm now, its light pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. She could feel the vast intelligence pressing against the weakening seals, ancient and patient and endlessly hungry. "I propose we finally do what should have been done decades ago," she said. "We end this, permanently, even if it costs us everything." The binding cracked audibly, and something roared in the depths below. The emergency town meeting hall had never felt smaller. Every seat was occupied, with more residents standing along the walls, their faces etched with the kind of desperation that comes from knowing your time is running out. The air was thick with whispered prayers and barely contained panic. When the doors at the back of the hall creaked open, every head turned. Sarah stood silhouetted against the dying evening light, her clothes torn and mud-stained, her face bearing fresh scratches that spoke of a harrowing journey through the forbidden woods. But it wasn't her appearance that caused the collective intake of breath. It was what she cradled in her trembling hands. The heartstone pulsed with an inner light that had been dormant for 17 years. Its crystalline surface, no larger than a human heart, cast dancing shadows across the walls as veins of silver fire coursed through its translucent depths. The ancient artifact that their grandparents had buried, that the town council had sworn was destroyed, that the old families had killed to keep hidden, Sarah held it like a newborn, terrible and beautiful and alive. Mayor Hendricks rose slowly from his chair, his weathered face draining of color. "Sarah, child, you don't understand what you're—" "I understand everything." Her voice carried across the silent room with startling clarity. "I understand why my parents really died. I understand what's been hunting us for decades. And I understand what choice we have to make tonight." The Heartstone's glow intensified, responding to her words. Several people in the front rows instinctively leaned away as shadows began to writhe and dance with unnatural movement around the artifact's base. Dr. Carver stood abruptly, his medical bag clutched protectively against his chest. The containment protocols were put in place for a reason. That thing has already bonded with you, hasn't it? Look at your hands, Sarah. Look at what it's doing to you. Sarah lifted her hands, and gasps echoed through the hall. Her palms bore intricate marks that mirrored the patterns within the stone, silver lines that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, spreading up her wrists like living tattoos. The transformation had begun. 36 hours, she said, her voice now carrying an otherworldly resonance. That's how long we have before they breach the barriers completely. The things in the deep woods, our ancestors didn't banish them. They made a bargain. The Heartstone was the price, and the containment was the trade. But the seal is breaking. Old Mrs. Chen, the town's unofficial historian, struggled to her feet with the aid of her walking stick. The children should leave. They shouldn't hear this. The children need to hear this, Sarah countered, because they're the ones who'll inherit our choices, just like I inherited yours. She stepped forward, and the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Frost began forming on the windows despite the September warmth outside. The Heartstone was drawing energy from everything around it, including the life force of everyone present. There are two paths, Sarah continued, her breath now visible in the suddenly frigid air. I can complete the bonding, become what the stone needs me to become. It will give me the power to reinforce the barriers, to keep the darkness contained for another generation. But the process, she paused, meeting the eyes of people she'd known her entire life. The process will change me into something that isn't quite human anymore, something that can survive what's coming but can't really live among you. Father Martinez clutched his rosary, whispering prayers in rapid Spanish. The Heartstone's light seemed to recoil from his holy symbols, casting his shadow larger and more distorted than it should have been. "What's the second path?" whispered Jenny Morrison, Sarah's former best friend, tears streaming down her face. Sarah's smile was heartbreaking in its gentleness. I destroy it, shatter the Heartstone completely, break the bargain our ancestors made. The barriers fall immediately, but so does the anchor that's been calling to the darkness all these years. Without it, the entities might lose interest in our little town. They might move on to hunt elsewhere. Might? Mayor Hendrick's voice cracked. You're talking about gambling with everyone's lives on a might? I'm talking about ending this cycle. Sarah's voice rose, and the Heartstone flared brighter. No more children orphaned by the town's secrets. No more families torn apart by things that shouldn't exist. No more living in fear of what lurks just beyond the tree line. The building shuddered as something massive moved through the forest outside. Through the frosted windows, they could see lights. Not electric lights, but the cold phosphorescence of things that had never known the sun. The entities were gathering, drawn by the Heartstone's awakened power. Sarah looked around the room one final time, memorizing faces, storing away the last moments of her humanity. You have 5 minutes to decide. After that, I choose for all of us. The lights outside grew brighter, and somewhere in the distance, something that might once have been human began to scream. The emergency floodlights cast harsh shadows across the gymnasium as Sarah stepped through the double doors, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Every face in the packed room turned toward her, and she could feel the weight of their collective fear pressing against her chest like a physical thing. In her hands she carried the glass sphere. It pulsed with that sickly green luminescence, the same color that had haunted their dreams for 17 years, the same color that had leaked from the ground the night the chemical plant exploded, though everyone in this room knew the truth was far more horrifying than any industrial accident. Mayor Henley rose from his seat at the makeshift podium, his face draining of color. "Sarah, how did you—" "I found it," she said, her voice cutting through the whispered prayers and muffled sobs that had begun rippling through the crowd. "In the Crawford House basement. Right where you all knew it would be." The sphere seemed to respond to the attention, its glow intensifying. Through the translucent surface, something moved, something that had once been human but was now something else entirely, something that pulsed and writhed and watched them all with eyes that had seen too much. Dr. Martinez stood up from the third row, her hands shaking. "Sarah, you don't understand what you're holding. That containment field—" "Containment field?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Is that what you're calling it? Because it looks a lot like a prison to me." The thing inside the sphere pressed against the glass, leaving a wet smear that vanished almost immediately. It had been trying to communicate, she realized, during the 3 sleepless nights since she'd discovered it. Trying to tell her something that everyone in this room had spent nearly 2 decades pretending not to know. "My daughter," she continued, her voice steadying despite the tremor in her hands. "My 8-year-old daughter has been having the same dreams as all of your children, the same dreams you've all been having since 2006. Dreams about the green light, dreams about the screaming that never stops, dreams about what really happened at the plant." Sheriff Kowalski moved toward the aisle, his hand instinctively moving to where his weapon should be. "Now, Sarah, let's just calm down and—" "Don't." The word cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare tell me to calm down, not when I know what you did, what you all did." The sphere grew brighter, and several people in the front rows scrambled backward, but Sarah held it steady, feeling the warmth seeping through the glass into her palms. It wasn't trying to escape, she realized. It was trying to remember. "It wasn't a chemical leak," she said, looking directly at the mayor. "It wasn't an explosion. It was an experiment, a government experiment that went wrong. And when it did, when that thing started changing everyone it touched, you made a choice." The silence stretched taut as a wire. "You chose to contain it, to trap it, to bury the truth along with everyone who got infected." Sarah's voice rose, carrying to the far corners of the gym. 12 people, wasn't it? 12 people who were in the wrong place when the containment breach happened. 12 people who started changing. Mrs. Chen, the librarian, was openly weeping now. "They weren't people anymore," she whispered. "You didn't see what they became, what they were turning into. So you decided for them." Sarah lifted the sphere higher, and the light painted grotesque shadows on the walls. "You decided they had to die. But this one you kept. Insurance, maybe? Evidence? Or just to remind yourselves of what you'd done." The thing inside the sphere pressed against the glass again, more urgently now. And for just a moment, Sarah could swear she saw recognition in those transformed features. Human recognition. "It's still conscious," she breathed, the horror of it hitting her fully. All these years it's been aware, trapped and aware, and trying to tell someone what really happened. Mayor Henley stepped forward, his face grave. "Sarah, you have to understand. If word of this gets out, if the government knows we still have a specimen, they'll quarantine the entire town. Everyone we've tried to protect." "Protect?" Sarah turned the sphere slowly, watching the thing inside follow the movement with desperate eyes. "You call this protection? You call 17 years of nightmares and buried guilt protection?" The glass was growing warm in her hands now, almost hot. The thing inside seemed to be changing, becoming more agitated, more active. "What did you promise it?" Sarah asked quietly. "When you sealed it away, what did you tell it?" No one answered. The sphere pulsed once, twice. Then the glass began to crack. "Sarah!" Dr. Martinez lunged forward, but it was too late. The sphere shattered in Sarah's hands, releasing 17 years of contained horror into the world. And in that moment, everyone finally understood that some secrets are too terrible to keep,